The individual renowned throughout history as Heinrich Müller was born in the Bavarian region of Munich, southern Germany, on April 28, 1900. His parents were impoverished Bavarian Catholics. His father was a rural police officer. Müller subsequently enrolled in a state-operated Volksschule, where he completed a rudimentary primary education, prior to commencing an apprenticeship with a mechanic shortly before his adolescence. Further details regarding his early life are scarce, and Müller maintained a largely opaque personal life throughout his lifetime. Müller was approaching adolescence during a period of turmoil in European history. For numerous years, the continent had been veering towards direct conflict among its major powers. A competition arose between Britain, France, and Russia, and two armed alliances formed, one comprising Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy, the other comprising Britain, France, and Russia, and these alliances were fueled by rivalries over naval supremacy between Britain and Germany, control of the Balkans between Austria-Hungary and Russia, and colonial possessions in Africa among all powers. During the summer of 1914, a regional diplomatic crisis in the Balkans escalated rapidly into a full-scale European confrontation subsequent to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the successor to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Sarajevo at the hands of a Serb nationalist. In the latter part of July and the first part of August, the great powers engaged in a brief period of hostilities before expanding the conflict to include countries such as Japan and the United States, in addition to Europe. The subsequent dispute, referred to as the First World War, would persist for more than 4 years. Under the leadership of Germany, the Central Powers engaged in intense combat in the trenches of northern France along the Western Front. Ultimately, Germany and its allies suffered defeat, while Britain and France emerged victorious. Müller, despite being a mere 14 years old during the outbreak of the war in 1914, was deployed in active military service until the conclusion of the conflict in November 1918. Due to his mechanization training, he had become an expert in aircraft maintenance, a rapidly developing industry during the early stages of air travel, which was less than a decade old. Due to his specialized knowledge, he was conscripted into the Deutsche Luftstreitkraft, the German Air Force, as the conflict neared its conclusion. In 1918, he served actively in northeastern France on the Western Front. At a time when observation balloons and basic reconnaissance planes were still in use to determine where artillery units should aim their fire across the trenches, a necessity for artillery units that could fire several kilometers across no man's land but could not see what they were aiming at, he fulfilled this function as an attaché to the artillery spotting unit. He was most highly regarded for his service and was honored with the Iron Cross for Valor and the Bavarian Military Merit Cross at the conclusion of the conflict. Consequently, he discharged from the military in 1918 with distinction, which set him apart from the subsequent senior members of the Nazi administration in that he did not harbor a lasting grudge against the manner in which the war had concluded. Müller, similar to numerous other ex-combatants stationed in Germany during the late 1910s and 1920s, gravitated towards the Freikorps following the conclusion of the war. In accordance with the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, which terminated the war, the Weimar Republic, which had been instituted to rule Germany after the German Empire collapsed, was ordered to demilitarize and decommission the overwhelming majority of its military forces. Presently, tens of thousands of soldiers aspired to become members of the Freikorps, also known as the Freikorps, a paramilitary organization comprised of military volunteers based in Germany that originated in Prussia during the 18th century. During the immediate post-war period, the nascent republic was plagued by communist unrest. This was fueled by the German Communist movement, which, inspired by the achievements of their compatriots in Russia since 1917, sought to seize power in the very nation for which Karl Marx had originally envisioned his communist utopia. In 1919 and 1920, significant numbers of Freikorps were deployed across the nation to quell such communist agitation. Müller, who was active among them, viewed the defeat of the transient Bavarian Soviet Republic, which seized power in Munich in April 1919, as an active duty with the Freikorps. Müller's patriotic fervor and familial ties to law enforcement, stemming from his father's tenure as a Bavarian police official, influenced his decision to pursue a career in policing during the early 1920s. Rapidly ascending the ranks, he was promoted to a senior position in the Munich Police Department's political office. His initial encounters with Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, were somewhat ironically adversarial, given his subsequent role in the Nazi regime that would come to rule Germany, and were facilitated by his participation in Munich's policing. 1920 saw the formation of the Nazi Party, which originated from the German Workers' Party. It originated as a political party representing German nationalists on the right wing, who advocated for a workers' revolution predicated on the rejection of communism. The organization's membership consisted predominantly of war veterans who were deeply disheartened with the Weimar Republic negotiated terms of the Treaty of Versailles and considered it a blemish on German honor. Early in the 1920s, veterans in Munich began to support the party, and under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, an Austrian national, it rapidly amassed tens of thousands of active members and implicit supporters across Bavaria. Müller, in the course of his police responsibilities in Munich during the early 1920s, would have been cognizant of the expansion of this subversive organization. However, this informal association transformed into something more substantial during the early winter of 1923. Around 2,000 armed Nazis attempted a coup d'état in Munich on November 8 of that year, with the intention of seizing control of Bavaria and proceeding on Berlin in an effort to overthrow the Weimar Republic. From a military standpoint, however, the Munich Putsch, or Beer Hall Putsch as it became known, was an absolute catastrophe. German military detachments stationed in Munich promptly dismantled the formation on the morning of November 9. Müller was additionally one of the Munich police officers who participated in the investigation and were found to be accountable in the weeks that ensued. Undoubtedly, Hitler and a number of the other senior commanders did not require further investigation. He was apprehended in the Bavarian countryside a few days later following a swift pursuit. However, his trial afforded him the chance to express his opinions to the German public, and he was sentenced to a 5-year prison term for which he served only 9 months. In essence, what is most remarkable about the Munich Putsch is that the Weimar Republic neglected to seize the opportunity to vanquish the Nazis during the episode. Müller's participation in the police investigations that ensued after the Munich uprising of 1923 resulted in the mistrust of numerous senior Nazis throughout the 1930s. His subsequent actions during the mid to late 1920s and early 1930s are once more relatively mundane. Müller continued to serve as a police officer in Munich, an endeavor that proved to be seminal in the long run due to his research into the methodologies employed by Soviet-Russian police organizations, most notably the Joint State Political Directorate, OGPU, the highest-ranking secret police organization in the Soviet Union from 1923 to 1934 and precursor to the NKVD and the KGB. Müller acquainted himself with the most recent surveillance techniques utilized by European secret police agencies and gained insight into how totalitarian regimes could surveil vast populations for the purpose of retaining power and stifling political opposition. He himself would implement these strategies during his later years as the director of the Gestapo, Germany's own secret police. In the interim, he employed these techniques in the 1920s and early 1930s to more effectively monitor communist organizations in Bavaria. Müller seemingly cultivated an extraordinary aversion towards communists, or what the German populace grew to despise as Bolsheviks, in reference to the Russian Communist Party. This animosity would later motivate a significant portion of his efforts towards the Nazis. During Müller's late 1920s and early 1930s, despite his relative anonymity, the country as a whole was undergoing profound transformations. After nearly a decade of rapid economic expansion in the wake of the First World War, the worldwide economy inflated in 1929, precipitating the so-called Wall Street crash. The Great Depression that ensued was particularly devastating for Germany. As a result of employment losses, millions of individuals fell into poverty. Life savings were completely depleted, rendering it challenging to afford essential foodstuffs and goods. Furthermore, extremist political parties gained ground against the more moderate establishment parties in this environment. Müller, upon his return to Bavaria in 1923, encountered the Nazi Party, which capitalized on German grievances regarding the post-war settlement amidst the prevailing economic instability. Shortly thereafter, they garnered extensive national support. By 1932, this support accounted for close to 40% of the vote in the Reichstag elections that year. Early in 1933, this figure dropped to less than 35%, but an agreement with the heads of German industry enabled Hitler to become chancellor at that time. The Nazis utilized their newly acquired position to outlaw all opposition parties and establish a one-party totalitarian state within weeks. The Nazis seized control in Germany in 1933 in this manner. Müller's political stance during this period was not wholly congruent with that of the Nazis. He was an adherent of the Bavarian People's Party, BVP, a pro-monarchy, conservative political party that supported Bavarian separatism despite its readiness to operate within the framework of the Weimar Republic during the 1920s. The BVP's unwavering adherence to Catholicism likely further resonated with Müller, whose political perspective at this juncture was firmly rooted in his Bavarian Catholic heritage. Undoubtedly, this viewpoint was shared by many, as the party maintained unwavering popularity throughout Bavaria throughout the Weimar era. Moreover, it possessed regional influence in Bavaria in early 1933, when the Nazis had seized control of Berlin. Germany, both historically and presently, operated under a federalist system, wherein significant authority was devolved to local administrations in regions such as Bavaria. Heinrich Held, the BVP minister-president of Bavaria, thus possessed considerable regional authority in Munich in 1933. However, in February and March of that year, he was swiftly challenged by the Nazis. Müller made a second betrayal of the Nazis at this juncture when he advised Held to engage in military resistance against the Nazis' endeavors to depose the BVP. However, Held declined and tendered his resignation from office. Following this, the minister-president of Bavaria's authority was revoked, and Bavaria's regional autonomy was entirely acquiesced to in Berlin. Thus, Müller discovered himself in a precarious position by the middle of 1933. On two separate occasions, in 1923 and 1933, he encountered a precarious situation concerning the Nazi Party, which had achieved absolute power in Germany. Unlikely to be rescued by a patron, he had anticipated expulsion from a high-ranking position within the Munich police department and blacklisting as an opponent of the regime. Müller had captured the attention of Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD for short, the Nazi security service, despite his compromising involvement in the Munich Putsch in 1931. The SD and the SS, led by Heinrich Müller, initiated the Nazification of the police forces of the former Weimar Republic in 1933. Furthermore, their journey commenced in Munich, where Heydrich acquired knowledge of Müller's proficiency in cutting-edge surveillance methodologies. Upon concluding that Müller possessed potential utility, the SD leader made the decision to mentor Müller instead of expelling him from the Munich police. Müller was expeditiously elevated to the rank of senior inspector by the conclusion of 1933. Müller, for his part, demonstrated a willingness to adjust to the new circumstances, reflecting his reputation for being highly flexible in his convictions and his primary objective being career advancement. Müller's professional trajectory throughout the 1930s and beyond was closely intertwined with that of Heydrich and the Gestapo. The Gestapo, also known as the Geheime Staatspolizei or Secret State Police, was established by Hermann Göring in April 1933. Historically, its territorial expansion primarily encompassed the northern and northeastern regions of Germany, within Prussia, the largest federal constituent state of the country. Nonetheless, its scope and operational domains expanded rapidly. Governor Göring transferred command of the Gestapo to Heinrich Müller, the leader of the SS, on April 20, 1934. 2 days later, Himmler appointed Heydrich as the chief of the secret police, which was subsequently given nationwide jurisdiction. The Gestapo evolved from rank-and-file police officers to a specialized police force, frequently staffed by academically gifted investigators, under the direction of Heydrich. Müller was expeditiously recruited and, by 1936, had ascended to the position of Gestapo Operations Director, essentially becoming Heydrich's second-in-command. However, this did contain a paradoxical component. Müller, despite having enrolled in the SS in 1934, refrained from aligning himself with the Nazi Party. In fact, a mid-1930s official report authored by a Nazi official documented his questionable association with the party. Notwithstanding these complexities, his career progression persisted in the years that ensued. Müller's work for the Gestapo encompassed a wide range of dimensions of Nazi-era German society. The secret police was especially active in suppressing political dissent against the Nazi regime in the beginning. This was predominantly concerned with German communism and trade unions, and Müller's protracted prosecution of communists in Bavaria during the 1920s and early 1930s was particularly advantageous to the Gestapo during this time. The Gestapo conducted surveillance and frequently apprehended former trade union officials during the mid-1930s, despite the unions having been substantially disbanded in 1933. The apex of these endeavors occurred in Müller's initial years at the Gestapo when the Marquardt Circle was dismantled. This coalition comprised moderate socialists who had developed connections with former Nazi Party members expelled by Hitler during the 1920s. During this period, the Gestapo primarily employed the protective detention policy, in which individuals whose political allegiances were dubious were apprehended and subsequently transported to the burgeoning concentration centers dispersed throughout the nation. They were detained here indefinitely and for extended periods of time without actual charges being brought against them. Additional factions under surveillance by Department A for political opponents of the Gestapo comprised intellectuals, reactionaries, and liberals. Müller harbored a strong aversion towards the latter. Additionally, the Gestapo scrutinized religious organizations closely, and Department B was charged with the specific responsibility of monitoring such entities. Bishops and other high-ranking members of the Roman Catholic Church were subject to heightened surveillance by the Gestapo, in part due to their political allegiances to the Vatican in Rome, which extended beyond Germany. Müller was also tasked with overseeing those segments of the media that had managed to preserve a degree of autonomy from the state-controlled media, which were progressively more dominant. These segments were led by Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Propaganda and Public Enlightenment. Ultimately, the Gestapo was responsible for supervising the surveillance of individuals' private spheres and any conduct deemed objectionable by the Nazi regime. An example of this can be seen in 1934, approximately at the same time that Heydrich drafted Müller into the Gestapo, when a specialized office was established in Germany to identify and monitor homosexual and lesbian individuals. Thousands of homosexual men and some lesbian women were identified and arrested in the years that followed. Many were sent to concentration camps, where they perished or were sentenced to hard labor. Müller's disposition was highly compatible with this type of activity. During the 1920s and early 1930s, he not only acquired sophisticated expertise in surveillance and other secret police methodologies in Munich, but he was also inherently well suited to the responsibilities entrusted to him in that year. Müller was a workaholic who, according to the observations of a number of senior Nazis, was available to answer their calls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. His personal circumstances may have contributed to this to some degree. He wed Sophie Dischner, the progeny of a Bavarian newspaper proprietor, in 1924. Furthermore, in January 1927, they welcomed a son named Reinhard, and in September 1936, they welcomed a daughter named Elizabeth. Elizabeth was born nearly 10 years later. The precise nature of the physical impairment that Elizabeth was born with remains unknown. Müller's family life became extremely strained after the birth of his daughter, and his contemporaries in the Gestapo and other security agencies agreed that his marriage was unhappy and that he rarely appeared in public with his wife and children. Moreover, after the war, a number of individuals testified that Müller appeared to spend his entire time in the office, returning home merely to slumber. Müller, apart from being a workaholic who sought to evade his personal life, exhibited remarkable ambition and a strong desire to progress professionally. This ambition appears to have been his principal, if not exclusive, source of motivation or drive. Moreover, apart from capitalizing on the opportunities it presented and how it could expand his power and influence within the Nazi regime, his politics were utterly malleable, and it is exceedingly difficult to ascertain his true stance on any given issue. In reality, his only truly discernible personal views during his time at the Gestapo were aversion to communism, not Nazism. This aversion emerged during the formative years of his life in Bavaria during the late 1910s and early 1920s, when he was employed by the Freikorps and subsequently the Bavarian police. Primarily, he was a scrupulous administrator, the type of bureaucrat devoid of imagination who would tolerate persecution, torture, and surveillance so long as it provided society with a sense of order and regulation. His adeptness at patiently interrogating suspects for hours or days, hoping to expose a weakness in their defense, astounded his contemporaries. Müller's participation in a power struggle within Germany in 1938 had significant ramifications for the trajectory of the nation's foreign policy. In order to establish a Greater Germany that would encompass a significant portion of Central Europe and serve as an initial stride towards conquering Eastern Europe for the purpose of acquiring Lebensraum or living space in the future, the Nazis were resolute in their intention to dismantle every provision of the Treaty of Versailles and reconstruct the German military, or Wehrmacht, to the extent that war could be declared. Notwithstanding the fact that Hitler and the Nazis dominated the state apparatus, the Wehrmacht maintained a substantial degree of autonomy. A considerable number of generals, who viewed themselves as heirs to the former Prussian military rather than as Nazi commanders, maintained political views that were radically distinct from those of Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, Göring, and other senior Nazi leaders. In addition, a number of these individuals opposed the country's hasty rearmament and the preparations for an unavoidable conflict with Great Britain, France, and Russia. Prominent among these obstinate commanders were Thomas Werner von Fritsch, the commander-in-chief of the German armed forces, and War Minister General Werner von Blomberg, who opposed Hitler's intentions to initiate a European war by 1942. Müller assumed a pivotal role in their expulsion. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair commenced in the early days of 1938, when it came to light that von Blomberg's newlywed wife, Erna Grün, had been implicated in prostitution rumors and had appeared in explicit photographs several years prior. Upon the revelation of this, Hitler utilized the scandal to compel the resignation of the war minister. Now, preparations were underway to unearth information on von Fritsch that was similarly compromised. Müller was assigned the responsibility of conducting this task. Subsequent days saw the accumulation of information indicating that the commander-in-chief was homosexual. This was determined by a report compiled in the Gestapo offices, which in fact pertained to Achim von Frisch, a cavalry commander. Further insinuations that von Fritsch had participated in discussions regarding the initiation of a military revolt, in addition to the false accusations, were sufficient to compel his resignation in February 1938. However, it was subsequently determined that von Fritsch had been unjustly accused in every aspect. However, Müller and the Gestapo had managed to accomplish their objective to such an extent that Hitler could now exert more authority over the Wehrmacht. In the aftermath of the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, Hitler further solidified his control over the German military through the appointment of the compliant Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel to oversee the army. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair and the subsequent purge of more doubtful personnel from the German army transpired amidst the Nazis' intensifying march towards war. Since assuming power in 1933, the Nazis' foreign policy had progressively become more aggressive. As soon as they had solidified their position, They initiated a gradual reconstruction of the Luftwaffe, the German aviation force, in contravention of the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles. Then, in March 1936, the remilitarization of the Rhineland represented an additional fundamental violation of the peace. This region, which shared borders with France and the Low Countries, was to remain virtually devoid of any German military presence in accordance with the Treaty of Versailles. Subsequently, events intensified. Austria was occupied in March 1938, and a few months later, the Nazis attempted to annex Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland and were granted permission to do so by the Allies, who believed they could still placate Hitler and the Nazis at that time. Then, during the early months of 1939, proxy regimes were established in the remainder of Czechoslovakia and Hungary. In response to the invasion of Poland by Hitler and the Nazis 2 days prior, Britain and France ultimately proclaimed war on Germany on September 3, 1939, thus initiating the Second World War. Müller played a pivotal role in instigating the conflict. It was uncertain whether the invasion of Poland in the summer of 1939 would ultimately initiate the war. Senior members of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler held the belief that if intervention in the country could be in some way justified to the international media, then perhaps Poland could be occupied without the outbreak of a more extensive war. This would grant the regime an even more extended opportunity to further expand its military capabilities. As a result, the decision was made to fabricate a pretext for the invasion of Poland. In an operation known as Operation Himmler, Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller were entrusted with this responsibility. This would constitute a false flag operation, wherein multiple purported Polish assaults on German border stations and officials in the vicinity would be staged in order to justify a German invasion of Poland. Müller personally oversaw the execution of a number of captives from the Dachau concentration camp while they were clad in Polish uniforms. Subsequently, their remains were interred at a German radio station situated at Gliwice, close to the Polish border, with the fabrication of a narrative claiming that the victims were Polish soldiers slain in an assault on the station. The aforementioned false flag operation was executed on August 31. The following day, Poland was invaded by Germany. Müller's role in Operation Himmler came at precisely the right moment to benefit his professional development. Senior Nazi members and the heads of the various security forces reached a decision, upon the outbreak of war, to consolidate the Gestapo and other police organizations under a new umbrella organization known as the Reich Security Main Office. The rationale behind this decision was to enhance operational efficiency by centralizing the security apparatuses across the expanding German territory in Europe. Furthermore, Heydrich was elevated from the position of Gestapo chief to the position of Reich Security Main Office chief. Notwithstanding his dubious political history, Müller's contribution to laying the groundwork for the war with Poland and Heydrich's support was sufficient to secure his appointment as the Gestapo's successor. In an effort to facilitate his advancement, he joined the Nazi Party belatedly in 1939, an action that underscored the peculiar circumstances he found himself in. An individual who attained such high authority within the regime appeared to be a lukewarm supporter of the Nazi Party. Müller was additionally elevated to the rank of senior leader or Oberführer within the SS. Due to these advancements in rank, Müller attained a position of the utmost authority within the German security apparatus. Heydrich and Himmler were the only two individuals with more experience. Müller, in his capacity as Gestapo chief from autumn 1939 until the conclusion of the war in 1945, oversaw the identification and repression of dissent against the regime. His specialized expertise in this domain, refined since the 1920s, centered on discerning perils associated with the Soviet Union and communism, with a broader applicability to Germany. An event that stands out in this context was the discovery of the Red Orchestra in 1941. This extensive network of communist sympathizers, with members situated in Berlin and other cities, disseminated leaflets and placards advocating for civil disobedience and socialist values throughout Germany. This encompassed individuals who held officer positions in the German Army and Air Force, in addition to members of the German judiciary, including Arvid Harnack and Harro Schulze-Boysen. Although these individuals had no substantial ties to the Soviet regime in Russia, the Gestapo was rife with suspicions that they were plotting something more sinister in the wake of the German invasion of Russia in 1941. After Müller ascertained the magnitude of the group in 1941, he maintained surveillance over them for several months prior to the implementation of mass arrests in the autumn of 1942. By the spring of 1943, the orchestra had been disbanded and well over 100 members had been arrested. Müller's operational scope significantly extended beyond Germany in the early 1940s, although his principal responsibility remained law enforcement work within his native country. In the weeks following the outbreak of war in September 1939, Germany had successfully subjugated and occupied Poland. The winter and early spring of 1940 were marked by months of inaction, to the extent that many began to refer to it as a phony war in Europe. However, a spate of conquests occurred in late spring. Beginning in April 1940, German forces swiftly occupied Denmark and Norway. The following month, in May 1940, they initiated a frenzied campaign that encompassed France and the Low Countries, ultimately bringing a significant portion of Western Europe under German control within 6 weeks. In early 1941, Hitler provided assistance to Benito Mussolini, an Italian ally, in his endeavor to conquer the Balkans. Subsequently, starting in June 1941, the German invasion of Russia occupied a vast territory encompassing Ukraine, Belarus, and a significant portion of Western Russia. Müller was confronted with a variety of issues outside of Germany during these rapid conquests, most notably those Central European regions of Western Poland and Czechoslovakia that were undergoing the most rapid assimilation into the German Reich. As soon as the conflict commenced, Müller became progressively entangled in the regime's treatment of the Jewish population residing in territories under German occupation. Since the party's inception in 1933, the Nazis had been conducting domestic persecution of Germany's Jewish community due to their virulent anti-Semitism. During the period preceding World War II, political disenfranchisement of German Jews was the primary objective, as evidenced by the 1935 Nuremberg laws. In addition to prohibiting Jewish German matrimony, these regulations limited the economic and employment prospects of Germany's Jewish population. In addition, the legislation effectively revoked the citizenship of German Jews. A significant portion of the objective behind these economic and political sanctions was to compel the nation's Jewish population to leave the country by means of emigration. This compelled them to either establish their own communities in the Holy Land, which occurred in the Middle East, or to countries like the United States and Britain. And this escalated in the months preceding the outbreak of war, most notably on Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when thousands of Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues were targeted and hundreds of German Jews were killed or seriously injured as a result of state-organized attacks across Germany. Müller played a significant role in this incident as the Gestapo member in charge of coordinating the apprehension of more than 30,000 German Jews in connection with Kristallnacht. Nevertheless, despite the severity of this persecution prior to the conflict, the Jewish population in Germany was comparatively modest. Due to the early years of the war's conquest of Eastern Europe, where the majority of Jews resided in Europe in the early and middle decades of the 20th century, millions more Jews came under Nazi control. The persecution imposed by the Nazi regime progressively escalated starting in 1939. Following the annexation of Austria and other territories in Central Europe in January 1939, the Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration was founded in Berlin. By the autumn of that year, a subsidiary office had already been established in Vienna. The primary aim of this initiative was to extend the policy of coerced Jewish migration, which had been implemented in Germany since the 1930s, to the recently acquired regions in Central Europe. Heydrich was designated as the supervisor of the Berlin office, while Adolf Eichmann served as his Vienna counterpart. In the years that followed, the operational scope of the central office would considerably broaden, specifically into Poland. Furthermore, Müller assumed a pivotal position in the operation of the Central Office, initially serving as Heydrich's deputy and subsequently as the chief of the Gestapo. The initial focus of the intensifying persecution of Jews in Europe was to compel widespread migration. Notable individuals including Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller were in charge of these endeavors. Müller oversaw efforts to relocate tens of thousands of Polish Jews into ghettos in cities such as Warsaw as early as October 1939. In this regard, he worked in close collaboration with Eichmann, the Security Service (SD) official in Poland who was entrusted with the responsibility of supervising policies pertaining to the Jewish population in the conquered nation. To reduce the Jewish population of Eastern Europe at this time, forced emigration persisted as the preferred strategy. However, despite the fact that millions of Jews resided in Eastern Europe, migration routes had been severely disrupted by the conflict. As a result, in 1940, Nazi policy began to converge on an absurd plan, backed by Eichmann, to convey the Jews of Europe to the East African island of Madagascar, where a vast open-air prison would be constructed. Nevertheless, this strategy was shelved during the course of 1941 when it became evident that Germany's inability to capture the Suez Canal from Britain in North Africa would render impractical the mass deportation of millions of European Jews. The date of Müller's revelation remains uncertain. However, surviving statements indicate that he was among the initial high-ranking individuals in the Nazi regime to become aware, in 1941, that Hitler and others, including Himmler and Goebbels, had devised a new and abhorrent strategy to address the Jewish question. The Holocaust ensued as a result of what is now recognized as the final solution, which entailed the coerced expulsion of European Jews into concentration camps situated primarily in Poland, Eastern and Central Europe, where they would be subjected to mass murder at the hands of the Nazi regime. As early as the late summer and autumn of 1941, concentration centers, including Auschwitz in western Poland, conducted experiments utilizing gases such as Zyklon B, which were subsequently employed in the execution process. Following this, the remains would be incinerated in crematoriums situated within the settlements. Müller was additionally provided with comprehensive information regarding the Einsatzgruppen, also known as death squads, which were established across Eastern Europe in 1941. These units would be accountable for the execution of more than 1.3 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of political prisoners over the course of the subsequent 4 years. Additionally, he assumed a prominent role in the coordination and supervision of these endeavors in the years and months that followed. On January 20, 1942, Müller participated in a conference that was held in Wannsee, a suburban area situated beyond Berlin. Heydrich orchestrated this event, in which Eichmann and Müller also significantly contributed. A number of the highest-ranking members of the Nazi Party and the SS, who oversaw the concentration camp system, were apprised of the final solution during this period. For the preceding 8 months, this plan had been formulated and finalized. Müller assumed an increasingly senior position in the subsequent stages of the Holocaust that was planned for the Jews of Europe. Much of the responsibility Himmler entrusted to him was to conceal the evidence of the ongoing mass murder by incinerating the remains of those who had perished in the camps. This became a particularly challenging task in Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the crematoria frequently lacked the capacity to burn the remains in a timely manner. Notwithstanding this obstacle, he was issued a directive in 1943 to embark on a journey to Italy with the purpose of coercing the Benito Mussolini regime to increase the deportation of Italian Jews to the camps in the north and northeast. Müller, along with Himmler, Heydrich, Eichmann, and Rudolf Höss, was ultimately appointed commandant of Auschwitz. From late 1941 until the summer of 1945, he oversaw the systematic extermination of the Jewish population in Europe. Although the final solution was ultimately determined by high-ranking Nazis such as Hitler, Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, and others, its day-to-day execution was predominantly entrusted to bureaucrats and administrators, including Müller, Höss, and Eichmann. Moreover, the policy yielded a disastrous consequence. Approximately 6 million European Jews perished between January 1942, when the Wannsee Conference was convened, and the early weeks and months of 1945, when the majority of concentration camps were liberated. This loss of life occurred in camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Sobibor, and Treblinka, as well as through Einsatzgruppen executions. Müller would have almost certainly been sentenced to death for his involvement in the Holocaust and would have been convicted as one of the most egregious war criminals in Germany had he ever been tried after the war. Müller was dispatched to Czechoslovakia during the summer of 1942 to supervise a rigorous investigation there. Heydrich was designated as the region's interim administrator in late 1941. Quickly recognizing his propensity to suppress any manifestation of political dissent with brutality, Britain and the Czechoslovak resistance movement identified him as a potential assassin. Consequently, a few months later, on May 27, 1942, two resistance fighters named Jan Kubas and Joseph Gabčík attacked Heydrich en route to his office near Prague as part of a mission designated Operation Anthropoid. Heydrich, who was fatally wounded in the assault and succumbed to his wounds a week later, became the sole senior Nazi commander to have had his assassination executed successfully throughout the Second World War. Müller was promptly directed to Prague with the purpose of conducting an investigation, as Gabčík and Kubas had managed to elude capture subsequent to inflicting injuries on Heydrich. Müller not only apprehended and executed the two assassins and the resistance fighters who had provided them with refuge, but also retaliated monstrously throughout Czechoslovakia, causing an estimated 5,000 fatalities, more than 13,000 incarcerations, and the complete devastation of the villages of Lidice and Ležáky. Additionally, the assassination of Heydrich altered Müller's standing within the security forces. Ernst Kaltenbrunner assumed the leadership role of the Reich Security Main Office subsequent to Heydrich's resignation in January 1943. Although he was now Müller's primary supervisor, it was clear that Müller operated with more autonomy under Kaltenbrunner's leadership than he had during Heydrich's reign. Müller was arguably the second most senior individual involved in the implementation of the final solution as a consequence of these developments. Himmler occupied the apex of those supervising the Holocaust as the leader of the SS, which had complete authority over the concentration camps across Europe. However, Müller's function of furnishing intelligence on the whereabouts and activities of Jews in Europe positioned him arguably second only to Himmler in this regard, while placing him above figures like Eichmann, who oversaw the logistical aspects of transferring Jews to the death camps in Europe, and Rudolf Höss, who oversaw as a result, Müller's tenure as the chief of the Gestapo during the 1940s is inextricably linked to his participation in the Holocaust. Müller devoted the majority of his efforts from 1943 to 1945 to uncovering conspiracies against the Nazi regime. Initiatives to depose Hitler and his associates were widespread during this period, originating from both sectors of the military and civil society. This was largely due to the waning confidence in Germany's prospects of victory in the conflict and the deteriorating war effort. Following their initial swift conquest of Ukraine, Belarus, and a significant portion of Western Russia in the late summer or early autumn of 1941, the German armies encountered a lull in the winter of 1941 outside of Stalingrad, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. Devoid of suitable protective gear for the harsh Russian winter, they were decimated in the weeks that followed. During the autumn and winter of 1942, endeavors were focused on the capture of Stalingrad. However, this plan was ultimately unsuccessful, and the tide of battle on the Eastern Front sank inexorably in favor of the Russians in 1943, who initiated the Germans' retreat into Ukraine and Belarus. In other developments of 1943, the Germans and Italians were expelled from North Africa in the early months of the month, and Italy opened a southern front that summer. Finally, in France during the summer of 1944, the United States, Great Britain, and the Western Allies established a Western Front. Now, the Nazis' defeat was not a question of whether but when they would be beaten. Numerous groups in Germany began devising strategies to depose Hitler and the Nazis and negotiate an end to the war with the Allies as soon as this reality became apparent. Müller was quickly confronted with a number of these conspiracies and disturbance pertaining to his position as Gestapo chief. An instance of this nature pertained to the dissolution of the Solf Circle. This assemblage, comprised of German scholars and intellectuals, had coalesced around Hannah Solf, the widow of Dr. Wilhelm Solf, a distinguished German statesman and diplomat who openly opposed the Nazi regime during the Second Reich prior to his demise in 1936. Even as the war erupted in the early 1940s, Hannah Solf hosted gatherings in her Berlin salon for those who opposed Hitler and the Nazis. Despite not being involved in any armed insurrection, Circle members had made concerted efforts to shield and assist German Jews in their escape from Germany prior to the outbreak of the Holocaust. A Gestapo agent infiltrated a Circle Tea Party on September 10, 1943. Consequently, the organization's senior members were apprehended. While some were deported to concentration camps, others were subjected to torment at the hands of Müller's Gestapo or even executed. Müller then instructed Gestapo agents to detain thousands of German students who were members of protest organizations during 1943 and 1944, including the White Rose and the Swing Youth. Once more, despite the fact that the majority of these individuals were participating in non-violent demonstrations, hundreds were tortured or even murdered. Despite the fact that Müller was preoccupied with numerous security concerns, none posed a greater threat to the Nazis' hold on power than the matter that the Gestapo chief was tasked with investigating during the summer of 1944. The 20th of July plot was a highly orchestrated conspiracy comprising several high-ranking German army officials. Its objective was to seize power by assassinating Hitler and other senior members of the regime. There was an expectation that an expeditious securing of favorable surrender terms from the Allies could be achieved by a newly formed military government. Operation Valkyrie originated from the conspiration, which was spearheaded by German officers including Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and General Friedrich Albrecht. Stauffenberg participated in a meeting on July 20, 1944, at Hitler's Wolf's Lair, which was situated in eastern Prussia, close to Rastenburg. Upon entering the room, he positioned an explosives-filled briefcase beneath the conference table. Following his subsequent departure to attend to a pre-arranged telephone conversation, the device detonated during his absence. Nevertheless, despite causing one death and injuring dozens of others in the room, Hitler was not killed by the detonation, possibly because von Stauffenberg had removed the briefcase prior to the explosion. This consequently rendered the 20th of July plot condemned prior to its inception. Following his departure from the meeting in the Wolf's Lair, von Stauffenberg returned to Berlin immediately. The conspirators' schemes for a more extensive takeover of power in Berlin was successful in the short period of time that Hitler and the senior commanders remained alive, and the conspiracy was swiftly exposed, putting an end to them. Albrecht and von Stauffenberg's schemes to seize strategic structures in Berlin ultimately proved unsuccessful by day's end. At around 1 a.m. that night, von Stauffenberg, Albrecht, and a number of other prominent dissidents were apprehended and subsequently put to death. Müller, in his capacity as a high-ranking Gestapo official, assumed a central role in the investigation into the conspiracy's extent. In the days and weeks that followed, over 5,000 individuals were ultimately arrested for having even the slightest connection to the plotters. It appears that a substantial majority of these individuals possessed limited or no understanding of the narrative. Müller's pursuit of the investigation was conducted with such severeness that individuals who were unable to unequivocally establish their innocence were nonetheless subjected to persecution. In fact, in excess of 200 plotters were put to death. Although Judge Roland Freisler, the preeminent figure at the German People's Court, imposed sentences on the implicated individuals, it was Müller himself who made the ultimate determination and appeared before this kangaroo court during the late summer and autumn of 1944. Müller exhibited a growing degree of fanaticism during the concluding phases of the conflict. By the winter of 1944, Germany's defeat had become an undeniable reality. Early in 1945, as the Russians barreled through Poland, they would cross the Oder River into the heartland of Germany. Even more remarkable was the rapid liberation of Western Europe by the Western Allies in the wake of the D-Day invasions in the summer of 1944. Furthermore, in late August, a brief offensive retook Paris, which was succeeded by an additional eastward push that achieved the liberation of Brussels and a significant portion of Belgium by September. During the winter of 1944, an advance into Germany and the Rhineland was now feasible. Berlin's capture was imminent, and the Western Allies suffering a fatal discord with Stalin and the Russians remained the only viable course of action for Germany at this time. In December 1944, the German military command endeavored to gain time by launching a counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest, situated in Belgium and Luxembourg. While this initially yielded favorable results, it ultimately served as a postponement strategy at best, hindering the achievement of more advantageous peace terms. However, Müller appeared to have genuinely held the belief that the conflict was once again tiding in its favor. During the dying days of 1944, he reportedly communicated to a Gestapo officer in Berlin that the Western Allies would be pushed back into France by the Ardennes offensive, and that Nazi flags would once again be fluttering above Paris in 1945. This was fantastical in nature. Müller, who had spent the majority of the conflict in Berlin, was joined in the capital during the final months of the war by an increasing number of senior Nazi officials stationed elsewhere in subjugated Europe for several years. He occupied himself with endeavors to drive divisions among the Allied leaders through the utilization of his network of double agents. At this time, implausible rumors circulated that the chief of the Gestapo had engaged in clandestine negotiations with the Soviet secret services. A genuine political conviction of Müller was his abhorrence of the Soviet regime. The rumors, which appeared to have been completely invented by an adversary for power in the Reich Security Main Office, Walter Schellenberg, appear to have been entirely unfounded. Later theories, however, would be fueled by the rumor that Müller was captured and shielded by the Russians at the conclusion of the conflict. In the final days of April, Müller was one of the officials stationed at Hitler's bunker in central Berlin. Documents indicate that he was observed in the area on April 30th, just prior to Hitler's self-immolation on that day. Furthermore, reports place him in the vicinity the following day, coinciding with the suicide of Goebbels, the successor to the Führer. The Battle of Berlin concluded the following day with the surrender of General Helmut Weidling to the Russians. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender and the official proclamation of war on May 8, 1945, the Allies commenced the laborious undertaking of identifying, apprehending, and prosecuting the highest-ranking Nazi officials and those culpable of war crimes. Furthermore, in light of its pivotal involvement in the Holocaust, the perpetuation of the totalitarian regime, and the systematic abuse and execution of tens of thousands of political prisoners throughout its existence, Gestapo members comprised a significant portion of its prosecutions by the Allies. The Gestapo, which had been defunct since the fall of the Nazi regime, was designated as a criminal organization by the Allies. In November 1945, when the Allies established an international military tribunal, it identified three critical German organizations: the senior membership of the Nazi Party, the SS, and the Gestapo, as requiring accountability for their actions during the war. Moreover, members of the Gestapo who were prosecuted in the subsequent Nuremberg trials included Göring, Kaltenbrunner, and Arthur Seyss in court, the leader of the Austrian Nazis. However, Müller evaded legal proceedings and was never convicted. In May 1945, as the conflict approached its last hours and days, the Gestapo chief simply vanished. Müller was last observed on May 1, 1945, in the evening. Joseph Goebbels, the designated successor to Adolf Hitler, committed suicide that evening, thereby deposing the Nazi regime. Müller was overheard stating at this moment that he had no intention of the Russians capturing him alive. Müller, in his capacity as the leader of an organization that had prosecuted Russian sympathizers and prisoners of war, had more reason than the average person to be apprehensive about his future. Therefore, he acquiesced to Goebbels' suicide shortly thereafter. However, unverified rumors suggest that he was in the vicinity of Himmler near the Danish border on May 11, just prior to the SS leader's apprehension approximately 1 week later. Müller, who, weeks later, remained untraced by the Allies, had been placed on their list of persons of significant interest and, should he be captured, Müller would be brought before the Nuremberg trial to account for his actions. As a consequence, the Counterintelligence War Room designated him as one of its highest priority targets who had yet to be apprehended on May 27, 1945. Müller was still missing despite intensive investigations conducted in the weeks and months that followed. He became the most senior figure in the Nazi regime whose whereabouts remained unknown subsequent to his disappearance. Although Müller could not be located, the mysterious manner in which he vanished has since generated a multitude of hypotheses regarding his whereabouts. One of the most widely held beliefs, largely influenced by Schellenberg's earlier assertions that Müller had participated in negotiations with the Soviets near the end of the war, was that Müller was taken into secret protective custody by the Russians in the aftermath of the war, shortly after the fall of Berlin. Additional unsubstantiated claims that Müller had been spotted in Moscow and other locations during the years subsequent to the war served to bolster this theory. An additional hypothesis, which garnered renewed attention in the early 1960s subsequent to Adolf Eichmann's apprehension in Argentina, posited that Müller, similar to numerous other Nazis, had sought refuge in South America after the conclusion of the war. Protection was extended to Nazi war criminals by the administration of Juan Perón in this location following the conflict. In the 1960s, investigations were conducted across Latin America in an attempt to locate Müller in response to this renewed speculation. Ultimately, the identification of a suspect named Francis Keith Willard, who was residing in Panama City at the time and was momentarily suspected of being Müller, was achieved. Ultimately, fingerprint analysis disproved this hypothesis, and as of this writing, there is no evidence to support the claim that Müller arrived in Latin America following the war. Following this, numerous inquiries were conducted in an attempt to locate Müller and ascertain precisely what transpired during that year in 1945. For example, the apprehension and subsequent prosecution of Adolf Eichmann in the early 1960s instigated renewed inquiries from both the West German and Israeli governments. Then, in 1999, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States released Müller's records for a second examination. The majority of these were contradictory. Certain accounts appeared to imply that Müller had passed away in the post-war period. Others, however, comprised testimonies from sources during the 1950s and 1960s that speculated Müller had defected to the Russians. Still others maintained that Müller could have remained unaccounted for as late as the 1960s. At the time, a committee of historians and other prominent figures produced an independent report which concluded that although they were unable to definitively ascertain what had transpired with Müller, it appeared probable that the United States government had not harbored him. This theory had been advanced by Russian counterintelligence agencies throughout the Cold War. Johannes Tuchel, the director of the Memorial for Jewish Resistance in Berlin, further complicated the enigma surrounding Müller's whereabouts in 2013 by issuing a statement claiming that Müller had perished or been murdered in the immediate aftermath of the German surrender in May 1945. Tuchel asserted that his remains, along with approximately 2,500 others, were interred in a mass burial at the Jewish cemetery in Berlin's Mitte district. Allied investigators discovered the grave in August 1945. Additionally, recently unearthed documents provided further support for this assertion, demonstrating that Allied investigators had indeed pinpointed the purported whereabouts of Müller's remains during that period. Moreover, according to Tuchel, Müller was observed wearing his police uniform and his identification was discovered on his person. As Jewish religious laws forbid the exhumation of bodies, It has been impossible to verify Tuchel's assertions. However, if they are accurate, this would appear to establish that the Gestapo chief was either murdered or committed suicide shortly after he was last seen in Hitler's bunker on May 1, 1945, during the Second World War. Müller's whereabouts are almost undoubtedly unknown to this day, owing to the passage of more than 75 years and the results of numerous investigations. It is highly improbable that Müller died in 1945, was captured by the Russians, fled to South America, or ultimately ended up elsewhere. His whereabouts continue to be regarded as a significant enigma of the Second World War. Among the most egregious leaders of the Nazi regime and the Third Reich, Heinrich Müller was undoubtedly among the most horrible. It appeared that his only interests and personality were the meticulous investigative and bureaucratic tasks he performed non-stop from the time he enlisted in the Gestapo in 1934 until the conclusion of the war 11 years later. However, on a political level, he was a bit of a mystery. During an earlier phase of his career, he was engaged in an inquiry into Hitler and the emerging Nazi Party in Bavaria, subsequent to the unsuccessful Munich Putsch of November 1923. In addition, during the late 1920s and early 1930s, he was a member of the Bavarian People's Party. During that period, he advised the regional administration in Munich to oppose the Nazis' 1933 takeover of power. Ultimately, his survival and success were facilitated by Heydrich's personal patronage within the Gestapo. Until 1939, he abstained from affiliating with the Nazi Party, which became a requirement for him to succeed Heydrich as chief of the Gestapo. Consequently, what remains is an ambivalent Nazi who appeared to have been more amenable to political machinations that served his professional aspirations. However, Müller's personal political inclinations had little bearing on the extent to which they mitigated the violent nature of his actions. Müller emerged as a prominent figure among the Nazi German leadership who bore the primary responsibility for the widespread persecution and violence that erupted from 1939 to 1945. In his capacity as the director of the Gestapo, he methodically exterminated individuals considered to be adversaries of the regime, including anti-war student protesters and those siding with the communist left. Numerous individuals were subjected to apprehension, torture, incarceration, or even capital punishment, occasionally for offenses that were comparatively insignificant. The ruthless manner in which Müller supervised the consequences in Czechoslovakia subsequent to the assassination of Heydrich in 1942 serves as an indication of the approach employed by Müller. However, it was Müller's involvement in the Holocaust that will forever remain linked to him. Müller assumed a prominent role in the persecution of European Jews beginning with Kristallnacht in 1938, and this influence grew substantially in the years that followed. Both his pivotal role in the Wannsee Conference of January 1942 and his status as one of the initial senior German officials to be apprised of the final solution in 1941 demonstrate his significance in the development of the Holocaust that it precipitated. In essence, the enigmatic conditions surrounding Müller's disappearance in 1945 were regrettable in that they prevented him from ever being tried for his atrocities at Nuremberg. In your opinion, what is Heinrich Müller? In your opinion, to what extent did he contribute to the organization of the Holocaust, and what transpired in the years that followed his disappearance in 1945? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.